Let me tell you something that still keeps me up at night. Not in a bad way. More like the way you lie there staring at the ceiling after something happened that you can't quite explain, something that shifted the way you understood the world. Or in this case, the universe. I was 26 years old when I first passed through a galactic transit checkpoint. I was a junior logistics courier for a mid-tier interstellar freight company called Harlovex Transit Solutions. We had maybe 43 employees, most of them human, a couple of Thren who handled the deep route manifests, and one very grumpy Calaxian named Broth who sat in the corner office and never spoke unless he was correcting someone's paperwork. The checkpoint I passed through that first time was called Meridian Gate 7. It sits at the junction of three interstellar trade corridors, the outer Vanthu Loop, the Relian Spine, and something the old charts just call the Pale Corridor, which nobody really talks about because nothing that goes in there comes out with clean logs. Meridian Gate 7 processes roughly 9,000 vessels per standard galactic day. It is, by any measure, one of the busiest transit points in this arm of the galaxy. There are checkpoints older than human civilization stationed there, security protocols written in languages that no living species currently speaks, scanners that can identify your molecular signature from the moment you exit warp, before you've even begun your approach vector. Every single species in the known interstellar community, every one of them stops at those checkpoints. Every species submits documentation. Every species waits. Except one. And I didn't understand why until the day I saw what happened to the Vreth diplomatic convoy that tried to skip the line. Set up. Okay, let me back up and give you the picture. Meridian Gate 7 doesn't look the way you'd imagine a galactic checkpoint should look. You grow up watching old holovids where space stations are these gleaming white rings rotating in perfect silence, everything clean and orderly and impressive. Meridian Gate 7 is not that. It's old, like genuinely ancient. The outer hull has been patched and repatched so many times that you can see the layers of different construction eras just by looking at the plating dark gray precursor era panels bolted next to amber Vanthu alloy bolted next to newer, paler Federation standard composite. The whole structure groans when large vessels dock. Not in a dangerous way, the engineers will tell you, just in an old way. Like a building that's been standing so long it's developed a personality. The waiting queue, the physical queue, the actual line of ships waiting for clearance can stretch for something like 40,000 kilometers on a busy cycle. You see these vessels hanging there in space, nav lights blinking at different intervals, different colors for different species. Thren ships pulse amber. Calaxian freighters run dark except for a single green beacon at the bow. The big Relian colony arcs are so massive they look like floating cities, and they pulse a slow, deep blue that you can feel in your chest even through the hull of a small courier ship. Human vessels use white and red, standard maritime colors, translated to space. Some of the older captains fought hard to keep that tradition when we first joined the interstellar community, claimed it was a matter of identity. I think mostly they just didn't want to fill out the forms to change it. I was riding in the co-pilot seat of a Type 7 courier shuttle small ship, 6-person crew, mostly cargo holds full of pharmaceutical compounds, and some sealed diplomatic packages I wasn't cleared to know about. Our captain was a woman named Reina Castellanos, 41 years old, 20 years in deep route courier work, and absolutely the most unflappable human being I have ever met in my life. Reina had this quality where nothing surprised her, not because she was numb to things, she noticed everything, actually, but because she had trained herself to observe first and react second. She always said panic was just information that hadn't been processed yet. She was the one who first explained the checkpoint to me, as we came out of our approach drift and slid into the queue. You see the color of the beacon on that structure. She pointed ahead at the gate itself, this enormous arching framework that vessels pass through one at a time. The amber pulse. Yeah, I said. That means the Vanthu Authority has primary operational control today, changes on a 6-cycle rotation. Vanthu run a tight queue. Efficient. They'll scan us, verify our manifests, check our ship ID against the registry, and we'll be through in about 40 minutes. That's not bad, I said. For this checkpoint, no, she leaned back. On a bad day you can wait 6 hours. I've done 14. Broth did 38 once, and he's never forgiven the Relian inspectors responsible. I looked out at the line of ships. There had to be hundreds of them just in our visible range. Does it always take this long for everyone? Raina glanced at me sideways. Almost everyone, she said. And something in the way she said it, that almost made me want to ask more. But a proximity alert chimed, and she turned back to her instruments and I filed it away. We were about 2 hours into our wait, slower than Raina had predicted, because a Calaxian ore barge ahead of us was having a dispute with the inspection officers about some improperly labeled cargo containers. When I first saw what she meant, a ship appeared on our scanner. Small vessel, not much bigger than ours actually. No cargo markings. Running with what I would later learn was a Class C diplomatic beacon, which is the galactic equivalent of flashing a very important ID and asking people to get out of your way. It came out of its approach vector at a completely routine speed, no urgency to it. It wasn't broadcasting distress. It wasn't a medical evacuation. It had no military markings. And it sailed right past the queue. I mean that literally. It just flew past, moved up alongside the entire line of waiting vessels and headed directly for the gate checkpoint without stopping. What is that? I said. Raina didn't even look up from her crossword puzzle. She kept physical ones, a habit she said kept her sane on long waits. What species? I checked the scanner. Human Earth Registry, looks like a private charter. She turned her paper 90 degrees and started working on a word running vertical. Then it'll go right through. They're not submitting to checkpoint. They submitted their approach documentation 2 days ago from their departure port. Standard pre-clearance protocol. Watch. She pointed at the gate. I watched. The human charter vessel, a sleek, slightly battered thing with the name Josephine stenciled in orange on the hull, approached the gate structure. There was a brief exchange of transponder signals that I could see on our comm screen, a pause of maybe 30 seconds. Then the gate opened, and the Josephine sailed through without stopping. I stared at it until it was gone. Why, I said slowly, was that allowed? And Raina finally set down her crossword. She explained it to me the way someone explains something they've known so long they've almost forgotten that other people don't know it. The pre-clearance protocol, officially designated in interstellar community documentation as the provisional entry framework for late contact species, or some equally bureaucratic title like that, was put in place roughly 60 standard years after humanity made first contact with the community. We were the newest major species in the network. We were also, by several metrics, the most chaotic, the hardest to categorize, and the most exhausting to standardize administrative frameworks for. Every other species had come into the community through a long process of slow contact, cultural exchange, framework negotiation, and formal treaty ratification. Some of that process took centuries. The Relians were in gradual contact for 600 years before their formal admission. The Vanthu took 240. Even the Thren, who are by most accounts a fairly easy species to deal with, took 80 years. Humans took 11. Not because we're special, not because we charmed everyone, mostly because we were so completely ungovernable by standard first contact protocols that the community eventually decided the simplest solution was to just let us in and figure out the details later. There's actually a famous internal community document from that era. Raina had read an excerpt of it somewhere, where a Vanthu administrator wrote, and I am paraphrasing here because I don't have the exact words, "The humans will not stop arriving regardless of our response. We may as well issue them credentials." So we got in fast. But fast admission meant messy paperwork infrastructure. Human ships weren't in the registry cleanly. Human identification systems didn't map neatly onto community ID protocols. Human merchants and traders and explorers were already spreading through transit corridors before the documentation frameworks had caught up. So instead of trying to force us into the standard checkpoint model, the community built a workaround: pre-clearance. Human vessels registered their trips from the point of departure, transmitted documentation in advance, and then moved through checkpoints on arrival without stopping, as long as everything in the advanced documentation checked out. It was, Reyna said, originally intended as a temporary measure, a patch while the permanent systems were developed. That was about 140 years ago. Nobody ever got around to replacing it. And by the time anyone wanted to, the Human Shipping Lobby and about 6 different community charter organizations had filed enough legal protections around the existing framework that changing it would have required an act of the full Interstellar Assembly, which, as anyone who has ever observed the assembly in session will tell you, is roughly as likely to happen as the sun deciding to rise from the west. So it just stayed. Humans kept pre-clearing, humans kept sailing through, and every other species kept waiting in line. Build tension. Now here is where the story actually gets interesting, because I was just getting comfortable with this information. Just starting to file it away under the category of weird bureaucratic quirks of galactic civilization, a category that was already fairly well populated by that point in my career, when the incident happened. We were still in the queue. The Calaxian barge situation had been resolved, apparently by the ore barge captain agreeing to repackage 3 cargo units and pay a fine, which Reyna told me was the standard resolution for about 70% of cargo disputes at this checkpoint. The queue had started moving again. We were maybe 35 ships back from the gate. That's when the Vreth convoy came. I need to explain the Vreth a little bit, because if you haven't dealt with them, you might not fully appreciate the weight of what happened. The Vreth are an old species. Like genuinely old. They were spacefaring before humans had writing. They've been members of the interstellar community since before the current community charter was written. They have a seat on the permanent council. They have entire sectors named after them. When Vreth diplomats travel, they travel with a security contingent and a protocol officer, and usually some kind of advanced team that contacts the relevant authorities at the destination and makes sure everything is arranged to the appropriate standard. The Vreth, politely, consider themselves something of a senior member of the galactic community, and less politely, they do not always take kindly to waiting. The convoy was 3 ships, lead diplomatic cruiser, 2 escort frigates. Flying the full Vreth diplomatic standard, a deep violet beacon array that I genuinely had never seen before and didn't know what it meant until Reyna explained it, because I was new and still learning to read the nav lights the way you learn to read people's faces. The convoy slid into the approach vector and immediately jumped the queue. Not the way the Josephine had, smoothly, without fanfare, with advanced documentation already on file. The Vreth convoy just moved, cut straight across the waiting lanes, flew directly to the front. I heard the comm crackle. The Vanthu checkpoint authority came on, a flat, translated voice, because Vanthu vocal anatomy doesn't produce sounds humans can easily parse. Vreth diplomatic convoy. This is Meridian Gate 7 primary control. You are out of queue formation. Please hold position at marker buoy 17 Alpha and await your clearance turn. A pause. Then the Vreth response, also translated, but with a quality to the translation that conveyed, even through the filtering, a very particular tone, like someone who has never been told to wait in their life and was not going to start today. This is the convoy of Under Ambassador Verath of the Third House. We carry time-sensitive diplomatic materials under Interstellar Community Urgent Protocol. We require immediate transit clearance. Another pause from gate control. Understood, Under Ambassador. We will expedite your clearance process. Please hold at 17 Alpha. Expedited clearance will move you to the front of the processing queue. Estimated wait is 18 minutes. 18 minutes is unacceptable. Now even Raina looked up from her crossword. 18 minutes, the gate controller repeated, with a patience that I could tell was professional and not entirely natural, is the minimum time required for standard security and documentation verification, Under Ambassador. We are prepared to begin immediately upon your arrival at 17 Alpha. We have already transmitted our diplomatic credentials. Yes, Under Ambassador, and they are being processed, 18 minutes. Another pause, longer this time. You could feel the silence on the comm frequency. The humans, the Vreth Under Ambassador said, do not wait 18 minutes. And there it was. The comm went quiet for a second. Then gate control came back, still patient, almost impressively patient now that I was paying attention to it. Human vessels operating under pre-clearance protocol submit documentation 72 to 96 hours in advance of arrival. The advanced processing eliminates the need for checkpoint halt. You are welcome to implement a similar pre-registration process for future transits, Under Ambassador. For this transit, the minimum checkpoint processing time is 18 minutes. I am requesting the same access extended to human vessels. Human pre-clearance protocol access is registry-specific and tied to species-level documentation agreements that are. I am aware of the documentation agreements, the Under Ambassador cut in. I am questioning their existence. Why is a junior species given unilateral passage while the Vreth, a founding community member, must halt and submit to processing? Raina had fully put down her crossword now. She was watching the comm screen with the expression of someone watching a weather system develop. That's going to go badly, she said quietly to me, not with any particular emotion, just as an observation. For who? I asked. She thought about it. Them, she said. The gate controller, and I want to give this voice credit, because whoever was manning that position had clearly dealt with some things in their career, responded without hesitation. Under Ambassador, Human Preclearance Protocol is a standing framework under Community Charter Amendment 7 Provisional Sub 11, ratified 112 standard years ago, and maintained under continuous legal renewal. Any species may apply to the Community Transit Authority for equivalent documentation framework consideration. The Vreth Diplomatic Service has been notified of this process through standard channels on 14 separate occasions over the past 40 years. In the meantime, we would ask that you move to marker 17 Alpha so that we may begin your expedited processing and have you through the gate in 18 minutes. Silence. Long silence. I looked at Raina. She was doing this thing with the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. 17 Alpha, the Under Ambassador said finally, and the words came through the translation filter like someone setting down a very heavy object on a table with slightly more force than was strictly necessary. The convoy moved to the marker. Here's what I noticed during those 18 minutes. The two Vreth escort frigates positioned themselves at 17 Alpha with their bow arrays pointed, not at the gate, which was where they were going, but slightly toward the main checkpoint structure. Not an aggressive angle, not a threatening one, more like a statement of position. A reminder that there were weapons there, even if they weren't being pointed anywhere in particular. The gate controller said nothing about it. The Vanthu security drones at the checkpoint did not respond or reposition. I mentioned it to Raina. Display posture, she said. Common Vreth diplomatic signaling means they're unhappy but not going to escalate. If they were actually escalating, the arrays would be live and pointed at something specific. How do you know that? I've been doing this for 20 years, she said. You learn to read the lights. The 18 minutes passed. The Vreth convoy was processed and moved through the gate. The under-ambassador did not say anything further on the open comm frequency. But here's the part that stuck with me. After they were through, after the gate had closed and the blue pulse of the gate systems had faded back to standby amber, one of the other vessels in the queue, a Thren long hauler named, I remember this, the Patience of Distances, sent a short message on the general frequency. Just 3 words, in standard galactic. 18 minutes pass. And then someone else I couldn't see who couldn't identify the ship responded with a sound that the translator rendered as laughter, but not human laughter, something older, deeper, the kind of sound that suggests whoever made it had been laughing at things for a very long time. Raina smiled at that one. Really smiled. Old joke, she said when I looked at her, at this checkpoint. For as long as anyone can remember. What's the joke? That everything passes in 18 minutes, she said. Diplomatic crises, storms, arguments, pride, everything. If you're patient enough to wait 18 minutes, you'll see the other side. Climax. I want to jump forward now. About 4 years, actually, because the part of this story that I actually need to tell you, the part that answers the question in the title, doesn't happen to me in that queue. It happens later. 4 years later, I'm not a junior courier anymore. I've done enough deep roots to know the difference between a Calaxian cargo dispute and a Calaxian negotiating tactic, which it turns out is not much of a difference. I've been through 17 different checkpoints across 3 trade corridors. I've seen the Relian colony arcs do their slow blue pulse enough times that it no longer makes me feel anything in particular. And I've started to understand something about human preclearance protocol that I didn't understand in the beginning. It's not actually about the paperwork. Let me tell you about the day I understood that. I was at a checkpoint called Harrell Station. Smaller than Meridian Gate 7, only handles about 2,000 vessels per standard day, mostly inter-corridor freight and some passenger lines. The checkpoint was run by a joint Relian-Thren authority, which made it unusually well organized, because Relians and Thren both have a very strong cultural relationship with the concept of precision. I was always waiting, that's courier life, when a human vessel came through on preclearance. Standard thing by then. I barely noticed it. What I noticed was the reaction of the vessel next to me in the queue. A Calaxian passenger liner mid-size, probably carrying a few hundred passengers, various species, running a tourism circuit through the inner corridors. The pilot of that vessel, a Calaxian named something I could not fully pronounce, but that the translator rendered as something like Tessic, opened a direct line to me. I'll be honest, it was unusual. You don't generally open direct lines to strangers in a checkpoint queue. It's considered mildly rude, like talking to someone at a toll booth. But Tessic opened the line, and what Tessic said was, "Human. Your species ship, it passed without stopping." "Yeah," I said, "preclearance. There's a documentation framework, it's been in place since." "I know what it is," Tessic said. "I am asking you why." And I started to give the same answer Raina had given me 4 years earlier. The fast admission timeline, the paperwork backlog, the legal frameworks that calcified around the temporary measure. But Tessic cut me off. "I know the administrative history," Tessic said. "I am asking you why the community allows it to continue." And I didn't have an answer for that one, not a good one, not one that felt true. So instead I said, "What do you mean?" And Tessic was quiet for a moment. And then Tessic said something that I've been thinking about ever since. My species has been in this community for 300 years. In 300 years, no Calaxian vessel has passed through a checkpoint without authorization. It has never been proposed. It has never been seriously discussed. The idea does not, and the translator struggled here, produced a pause, then resolved, the idea does not occur to us as possible. It is a checkpoint. You stop. You submit. You wait. That is what checkpoints are for. Another pause. But humans, Tessic said, made it so that stopping was optional. In 11 years, while every other species in this community has spent centuries operating within the stopping framework, humans simply made the stopping optional. And then the community built a legal structure around the fact that you had already made it optional. So the optionality became the law. I thought about that. Is that bad? I said. No, Tessic said. That is what I am trying to understand. It is not bad. The community still functions. The checkpoints still work. Security is maintained. The pre-clearance system arguably provides better advanced documentation than the standard checkpoint stop. A pause. But the stopping, the mandatory halt, was the symbol. Do you understand? It was not purely functional. Every species stops because stopping says, I respect the authority of this checkpoint. I submit to the systems of this community. I am willing to be verified. And humans don't say that. Humans, Tessic said, say it 72 hours in advance from the comfort of their departure port and then sail through without stopping, and the community accepts that this is the same thing. I sat with that for a while. Is it? I said. Long pause. That, Tessic said, is what keeps me interested in your species. The line moved. We drifted apart. I never spoke to Tessic again. But I kept thinking about what they said. And about a month later, I was at a checkpoint called the Velen Crossing, one of the oldest in the corridor network, pre-community, built by a species that isn't here anymore, when I saw the thing that finally put it all together for me. The Velen Crossing checkpoint is staffed by a mixed-species team under community authority. At the time I passed through, the lead security officer was a Relian named, and Relian names are long, so I'm just going to give you the shortened version that she allowed, a rat. She had been at that post for something like 40 of our years. She was not tall by Relian standards, but she carried herself like someone who had learned long ago that authority doesn't come from height. A human vessel came through on pre-clearance. Routine. The gate processed the transponder signal, verified against the advanced documentation, opened. What was not routine was the vessel that came in right behind it. Small ship. Unregistered, not in the community registry, not in any registry I could see on the scanner. No species identification. No beacon. Just a dark hull moving at a controlled speed toward the gate. Everything happened very fast after that. The checkpoint security systems flagged the unregistered vessel. A rat came onto the general comm herself, not a subordinate herself, which told me she'd assessed the situation and decided this was one she needed to handle personally. Unregistered vessel, this is Velen Crossing Security Authority. You are in a restricted transit zone. Halt immediately and transmit identification. The vessel did not halt. It accelerated slightly. Not toward the gate, toward the checkpoint structure itself. And what happened next happened so fast that I had to review the scan logs afterward to understand the sequence. 3 things occurred in what I would estimate was about 4 seconds. First, the Velen Crossing automated defense systems came online. I could see the targeting arrays swivel on the exterior of the structure. A wall of containment drones deployed, small, fast, designed to intercept vessels up to 3 times the size of the intruder. Second, the unregistered vessel launched a jamming pulse, not a weapon, a signal disruptor. Suddenly everything on the checkpoint frequency went to static. The containment drones, which relied on directed comm signals for coordination, lost cohesion. They didn't deactivate. They just stopped acting as a coordinated system and started acting as 47 separate confused machines. Third, a human. A human being in a suit came out of the checkpoint structure through an external maintenance hatch. Not in a combat suit, not in military armor, in a standard-issue courier EVA suit, the kind you use for basic spacewalk maintenance. White with orange trim, a helmet with a faceplate that fogged up if you breathed too hard. The human had a magnetic tether line attached to the structure. And what that human did, in a standard EVA suit, with a magnetic tether, during an active security incident while the communication systems were being jammed, was cross the 50 meters of open space to the nearest containment drone, pull a physical access panel off its housing, and hardwire a manual override signal using a tool kit that I later found out was just a standard maintenance kit. One drone locked onto the intruder. The human moved to the next drone, did it again. Then the next. 3 drones locked in about 90 seconds of EVA work. The intruder vessel tried to maneuver. The 3 locked drones adjusted slower than the automated system would have been, but enough. They boxed the intruder against the checkpoint structure's magnetic field barrier. It wasn't going anywhere. The jamming pulse cut off, either because someone aboard the intruder had decided resistance was over, or because the systems failed, I don't know. The general comm came back online. A rat's voice came through, extremely calm. All units intruder contained. Initiating standard boarding protocol. Checkpoint remains operational. A pause. Chen, get back inside. And the human in the EVA suit, Chen, apparently turned around, pulled himself hand over hand along the tether back to the maintenance hatch, and went inside. The whole thing, start to finish, was maybe 3 minutes. I sat there in my ship for a long moment. Then I opened a line to checkpoint control, not the security channel, the standard civilian channel. This is Courier Shuttle DHV-7 out of Harlovex Transit. We witnessed the security incident. Is it, should we hold position? A pause, then a different voice from the control room, not a rat, someone junior. Hold position, DHV-7. Incident is contained. Q will resume in approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes, not 18. I almost laughed. Later, after we'd cleared and were through the gate and back in open space, I found out a little more about what had happened. Not through official channels, just through the network of couriers and freight pilots who all know each other in the way that people who keep passing through the same checkpoints eventually do. The intruder vessel was a smuggling operation. Species unknown, or at least officially undisclosed, which in my experience usually means politically inconvenient. They'd been running a route that exploited the narrow window between a human pre-clearance vessel passing through and the gate resetting. A window of maybe 8 seconds when the gate system's attention was on completing the pre-clearance verification, and the next standard checkpoint cycle hadn't fully initialized. 8 seconds. Someone had been watching this checkpoint long enough to find an 8-second window. And here's the part that got me. Chen, the human in the EVA suit, had also been watching. Not for 8 seconds, for 3 weeks. A rat had assigned Chen to monitor for exactly this kind of exploitation after another checkpoint in the network had flagged a similar pattern. Chen had been doing regular EVA maintenance shifts as cover, keeping eyes on the gate timing. When the intruder made their move, Chen was already suited and at the maintenance hatch. Chen had figured that the jamming pulse would disrupt the drone network, had pre-identified the 3 drones with the most advantageous intercept angles, had preloaded the manual override code onto the maintenance tool kit. All of this in advance, based on a hypothesis about a smuggling pattern that had never actually been confirmed. Did a rat authorize all that? One of the other couriers asked, when we were swapping stories on a shared radio frequency. The person who told the story paused. A rat authorized the EVA monitoring shift, they said. The rest, Chen improvised. A long silence. Then someone else said, yeah, that sounds right. Resolution. I thought about all of it on the long burn back to Harlovex's depot station, the Josephine sailing through the gate, the Vreth convoy at 17 Alpha, Tessik's question, Chen in the EVA suit. I thought about something Raina had said once, on a long transit when we had nothing to do but talk. She said, you know what I think the community never fully understood about us? That for us, a rule is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. I'd thought that was just a clever thing to say the first time, one of those lines that sound smart in the moment. But it kept coming back to me. Every other species, the Vanthu, the Thren, the Relians, the Calaxians, the Vreth, every single one of them when they encountered a checkpoint encountered a rule. And the rule said, stop, submit, wait. And they stopped and they submitted and they waited because that is what the rule said, and the rule had a reason, and respecting the rule meant respecting the reason behind it. And then humans showed up. And humans stopped, initially because they had to, because they were new and they didn't have the political weight to do anything else. But while they were stopping and submitting and waiting, they were also asking, why exactly is the stopping the part that matters? The security check is what matters. The documentation is what matters. If we give you better documentation in advance, does the stopping still need to happen? And the community apparently decided, well, if the documentation is better, then no, the stopping doesn't strictly need to happen. And then someone filed the legal paperwork, and then it became law. Not through rebellion, not through defiance, not through forcing anyone to do anything, just through asking a question that nobody else had thought to ask, because nobody else had been standing outside the framework long enough to see the framework from the outside. That's what Tessik was trying to articulate, I think. Not that humans were cheating, not that the community had made a mistake, but that humans had looked at a checkpoint and seen not just a rule but a mechanism. And then asked what the mechanism was actually for, and then built something better. And the community, being composed of old and careful and precedent-respecting species, had looked at what humans built and said, well, it works, technically. Better than the old system, actually. We'll allow it. And then they'd allowed it for 140 years. The pre-clearance system, by the time I was working in it, processed more advanced documentation than any equivalent checkpoint halt system in the community. Human vessels were, statistically, among the best documented at arrival of any species in the network. Because if you're going to make the stop optional, you have to make the documentation bulletproof. You have to make the pre-clearance so thorough that nobody can question it. Which meant that the system built to let humans skip the stop ended up producing better security data than the system where everyone stops. I'm not saying this to be triumphant about it. I'm saying it because it's strange, because the whole thing is strange. A workaround that worked better than the thing it worked around. A temporary measure that lasted 140 years. A species that asked a question and accidentally wrote a new chapter in galactic transit law. I came back to Raina about a month after the Velen crossing incident. We were on another run together. She'd taken me back on as crew for a long-haul route that needed an extra set of hands and someone she trusted. We were deep in the outer Vanthu loop, which is quiet and cold and takes a long time to cross, which means you have a lot of time to talk. I told her everything. Tessik's question, Chen in the EVA suit, the thing I'd figured out about the mechanism versus the rule. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was very Raina. Then she said, you're mostly right. Mostly. The thing you're missing, she said, is why we keep being trusted. I waited. The pre-clearance system exists because we asked the right question, she said. But it keeps existing after 140 years with no legal challenge that's actually succeeded because we've never abused it. She turned to look at me. Think about that. We have a system that lets human vessels bypass the stop. No other species has that. And in 140 years, we haven't used it to smuggle, to sneak, to cheat, to run contraband, to do anything that would give the community a reason to shut it down. Not in any pattern. Not systematically. Individual bad actors. Yes, obviously, humans are humans, but not as a systematic abuse. Isn't that just the minimum you'd expect? From us? Maybe. She turned back to the navigation screen. From the community's perspective, from the perspective of species who spent centuries watching humans be chaotic and unpredictable and impossible to standardize. I think the fact that we built the pre-clearance system and then actually used it correctly was not the minimum they expected. I think it surprised them. I thought about that. Chen, I said. What about Chen? Chen didn't wait for authorization. Chen improvised, built a solution to a problem that hadn't been confirmed yet, used a maintenance shift as cover. I paused. That's not exactly by the book. No, Raina said, it isn't. So how is that the same as what you're describing, using the system correctly? Raina thought about it for a long moment. The ship hummed around us. Stars slid past on the long drift. Because Chen's improvisation protected the checkpoint, she said finally. It wasn't for personal gain. It wasn't defiance of authority. A rat authorized the EVA monitoring, and when the incident was over, Chen came back inside immediately when called. The improvisation was in service of the system. Even the part that went beyond the authorization. She paused. That's actually harder to do than following the rules. Following the rules is easy. You just do what you're told. Improvising in service of something larger than yourself, under pressure without authorization, and then coming back inside when the job is done, that requires you to understand not just what the rule says, but why the rule exists. What the rule is actually trying to protect. She looked at me. Chen understood what the checkpoint was for. So when the checkpoint was threatened, Chen protected what it was for. Even in ways the rules didn't cover. Because Chen wasn't following the rules, Chen was following the thing the rules were built to protect. I was quiet for a while. That's a lot of trust, I said. Yes, Raina said, it is. Another long pause. And you think we've earned it? She smiled, not the half-smile from the Meridian Gate queue, a fuller one. I think we're still earning it, she said. Every time a human courier files their pre-clearance documentation completely and correctly, every time a human vessel doesn't exploit the 8-second window, every time a human in an EVA suit goes out into open space to protect a checkpoint they're not even required to stop at. She turned back to the stars. That's not compliance. That's something else. What would you call it? She thought about it for a long time. Investment, she said. Ending. Here's what I want to leave you with. I've been in this job for a long time now. I've passed through more checkpoints than I can count. I've seen the lines of ships, the amber Thren pulses, the dark Calaxian beacons, the slow blue breath of the Relian arcs, and I've felt the particular quality of waiting that happens in a checkpoint queue, which is different from any other kind of waiting. Heavier, more conscious of itself. And every time, every single time, I watch a human vessel pass through on pre-clearance, I think about what Tessic said. The idea does not occur to us as possible. That's the real thing, isn't it? Not that we found a workaround, not that we built a better documentation system, not even that we've been trustworthy with it for 140 years. It's that we were the only species for whom the question, do we have to stop, occurred to ask. Not as defiance, not as arrogance, just as genuine curiosity, just as the honest observation of newcomers standing outside a system, seeing it from the outside, and wondering whether the stopping was the point or whether the stopping was just the method. Every other species had spent so long inside the system that they'd stopped being able to see it as a system. The checkpoint was just the world. You stopped because you stopped. The rule existed because the rule existed. And then we showed up. And we'd been on our own for so long, making our own rules, breaking our own rules, rebuilding our own rules from scratch so many times that the rebuilding was just part of how we operated, that we couldn't help seeing the system as a system, couldn't help asking the question. I don't think that makes us better. I genuinely don't. There are things the Vanthu understand about patience that we may never learn. There are things the Relians know about building something that lasts that we can barely imagine. The Thren have a concept of collective wisdom that makes most human institutions look like sandcastles. But there is something, and I have spent years trying to name it, and the best I can do is this. There is something about being a young species in an old galaxy, about arriving late to a party that's been going on for millennia, about having to figure out, very quickly, which of the rules are load-bearing walls and which ones are just furniture that's been in the same place for so long that everyone's forgotten it can be moved. We moved the furniture. We filed the paperwork to do it legally. We built something better to replace it. We've spent 140 years proving that we moved it for the right reasons. But we moved it. And sometimes, late on a long transit, when the stars are sliding past and the ship is quiet, and there's nothing to do but think, I wonder what other furniture is still in the wrong place. What other questions nobody's thought to ask yet. What other 8-second windows are waiting to be discovered, not by smugglers, but by the next human who gets curious enough to watch. We are a young species in an old galaxy. We have so many questions left. And I really think, the old galaxy is starting to be glad we're here to ask them. The checkpoint at the end of the universe doesn't care what species you are. It cares whether you understand what it's there to protect. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's exactly the right question to ask someone before you let them through.